This year, the Atlas Society celebrates its 25th anniversary. So I thought I would begin by recalling just why the name Atlas is meaningful to us. Ayn Rand took the name of Atlas for the title of her greatest novel because Atlas was the Titan who held the heavens on his shoulders. In a literal context, she believed that sustaining role was played by mankind's greatest creators. In the modern context, she thought it was played most especially by those who translate man's great intellectual advances into life-sustaining goods and services. In a word, Atlas today is the modern businessman. Of course, it is not unusual to compare great businessmen to creatures of more than ordinary stature. Terms meaning great man, such as tycoon and magnate, are frequently used to denote businessmen. And even supernatural beings are often used as metaphors: wizards, giants, and, yes, titans. Ron Chernow's biography of John D. Rockefeller is called Titan. So Ayn Rand was not distinguished by her belief that businessmen are among the most powerful of human beings. She was distinguished in the 20th century by her belief that they are among the world's best human beings. But several writers in the 19th century, such as Samuel Smiles, had said almost as much. No, what distinguishes Rand from all previous writers is her conviction that the world's greatest businessmen have been the world's greatest victims. Today, in our mixed economy, it is easy to dismiss all capitalists as crony capitalists. But the question we ought to be asking is not, has this or that businessman ever accepted a handout or a subsidy? First and foremost, we should be asking, is he a producer? Is he a creator? If the answer is yes, then we should ask, secondly, how has he been treated by the world? Has he been honored and celebrated, or has he been deprived of his due rewards and due recognition? To identify such producers and call attention to the injustices they suffer was the reason that I founded the Business Rights Center. And over the course of several years, I wrote about the persecution of such great producers as Mike Milken, Frank Quattrone, Martha Stewart, and of course, Greg Reyes. But today I would like to tell you one more story about an Atlas and how he was crushed because he was a great producer. His name is Bill McGuire, and he was destroyed in 2006 by the Wall Street Journal, specifically by the hysteria its reporters had created over the issue of backdating stock options, although McGuire protested that he had never engaged in the practice. McGuire's case interests me partly because of the magnitude of his business achievements, but partly also because he was not the victim of a crusading prosecutor, as Mike Milken was the victim of U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani, as Frank Quattrone and Martha Stewart were victims of U.S. Attorney James Comey, and as Greg Reyes was a victim of U.S. Attorney Kevin Ryan. Bill McGuire, the CEO of UnitedHealth Group for 15 years, from 1991 to 2006, was a victim of our intelligentsia, who have been empowered to destroy producers by the 10,000 commandments that have emerged from the concept of white-collar crime. That interests me because I am writing a book about the concept of white-collar crime and the 10,000 commandments that have come to define it. Under the regime of these myriad commandments, I argue, the destruction of businessmen no longer requires initiative on the part of a U.S. attorney or a state attorney general or a regulatory bureaucrat. Our businessmen can now be destroyed merely because some savvy members of our anti-capitalist culturati, such as journalists or professors or public interest lawyers, decide to undertake the project of bringing him down. In a manner reminiscent of the power formerly wielded by the clergyman, these ideologically driven anti-capitalists can virtually force our society's judicial agents to put muscle behind their hatreds. Now, in order to explain the destruction of Bill McGuire, I must step back a bit and describe a phenomenon that I call Platonic capitalism. Platonic capitalism is a rhetorical device for damning capitalism because it fails to live up to a supposed ideal. The most familiar example, I suppose, is perfect competition. Under capitalism, competition is supposed to keep prices low. And so it does, critics say, when competition is perfect. But in the real world, competition may be flawed. In the Yukon, there may be only one grocery store in 100 miles, possibly more. And when capitalism is imperfect in that way, the government must step in to prevent the store from charging monopoly prices. So much for theory. On to history. The last major victory over Platonic capitalism by a businessman came during the New Deal's greatest anti-business prosecution, the trial of Chicago's Samuel Insull, which I spoke about last year. The government alleged that Insull's accounting methods were wrong, according to the government's Platonic standard, and therefore had deceived the public in a manner tantamount to fraud. But the judge in the case said Insull had a right to keep his books any way he saw fit. If charged with fraud, he had only to convince a jury by expert testimony that his accounting methods were defensible. Insull produced witnesses, the jury accepted their testimony, Insull was acquitted on all charges, and the Roosevelt administration vowed that it would never happen again. Their mechanism for ensuring it would never happen again was the Securities and Exchange Commission. And since the creation of the SEC in 1934, the Platonization of American capitalism has proceeded apace for two reasons. First, a division had long existed within the accounting profession between groups I call doctors and engineers. Accountants who saw themselves as doctors understood the corporate CEO to be their ultimate client, and their role was to be that of his advisor. Accountants who saw themselves as engineers thought of the public as their ultimate client, and their role was to be one of enforcing objective principles on wayward CEOs. Obviously, the creation of the SEC was a triumph for the engineers. Within this post-SEC context, accountants began analyzing the use of stock as executive compensation and the even more nettlesome questions surrounding the use of stock options as compensation. Beginning in the late 1930s, accounting journals hosted an intense debate over the methods of dealing with such options. Yet in 1962, a full generation later, the continuing debate was summed up thus in the Harvard Business Review. There are three ways of treating options that are used as compensation, and all of them can muster persuasive arguments. The general opinion was, choose one method, say what you're doing, and be consistent over time. And that, I believe, would have been the free market anti-Platonist solution. But such openness to individual goals and contextual judgments was unacceptable to the Platonists at the SEC and within the accounting profession. They were determined to settle on the one true standard. In 1972, the accounting profession's Accounting Principles Board issued a diktat regarding options as compensation. Because it was the board's 25th diktat, it lives on in infamous memory as APB 25, like 10-289. Of the three plausible approaches that the Harvard Business Review had noted in 1962, APB 25 picked one and then changed the terms of that method so that it became absurd. The plausible approach had said this: options should be charged to the company as a non-cash expense at the time when they are granted. The company's board should make a considered judgment as to what that expense is. After all, they are the ones negotiating the contract, and they are in the best position to know how much the options are worth. But that would have involved a contextual judgment by corporate executives. So APB 25 rejected it and declared instead, because there is no Platonic method of evaluating the worth of options when issued, they must be valued according to the measurements that would prevail if the recipient could exercise the options that very day. Even though the recipient might be legally banned from exercising the options for years, and even though he might never exercise them because of a falling stock price. What makes this approach absurd is that it implies the option grant has no value if the exercise price is equal to the stock price on the day of issuance. Yet employees accept such option grants in lieu of cash precisely because they do have value. Such was the nonsense of APB 25. The IRS, which is often more sensible in these matters, treats options as an expense only if and when they are exercised. What was the reaction of businessmen to APB 25? Most apparently rejected the approach of treating options as an expense upon issuance, So they decided to get around the requirement of to do so by using the absurdity of APB 25 against itself. All they had to do was set the exercise price of their options equal to the stock price on the day they were issued. Presto, the cost of the option was zero. There were still difficulties, however. Options with lower exercise prices are more valuable if the stock goes up and may retain some value if the stock goes down. So employees naturally wanted low exercise prices. Most especially, they did not want options with higher exercise prices than the options of a fellow employee hired at approximately the same time to do the same work. Yet the company's stock price varied day by day. If options were granted on the day of employment, exercise prices were bound to vary accordingly, assuming that the cost of the option had to remain zero. The answer was to use backdating. Grants of options did not have to be reported to the SEC for weeks or even months, at least before Sarbanes-Oxley reduced the reporting time to 2 days. So before 2003, one could wait for a number of weeks, look back to find the stock's relative low point during that period, and then declare that all recent options had been awarded as of that low point date. The exercise price was equal to the stock price on that date, so the cost to the company was still zero. This as-of procedure is not inherently fraudulent. If I want to rent an apartment on March 1st, but the landlord demands that I rent it as of January 1st, we can draw up an agreement to that effect. When backdating is legitimate and when not is a tricky legal question. But so far as I can find, the Wall Street Journal never discussed the matter during its entire year-long witch hunt against backdated options. At any rate, backdating is what companies began doing. The first, so far as we know, was Home Depot. No sooner had Home Depot been established in 1980 than it began to backdate its options, even though 2 of its 3 principal executives had had careers at top 8 accounting firms. In 1990, Microsoft announced, very publicly, and with the approval of its outside accounting firm, that it would begin using backdating to set its options advantageously for its employees. Nobody blinked an eye. In 1996, a chip maker named Micrel Semiconductor, which had an intensely moral CEO of the Mormon faith, Raymond D. Zinn, also publicly began using backdating, also with the acquiescence of its outside accounting firm. Nobody blinked an eye. Simply put, few people, even at the highest levels of law and accounting, understood fully the ins and outs of APB 25 and the legitimacy of issuing options as of a date in the past. Larry Sonsini, perhaps the leading business lawyer of Silicon Valley during the 1990s, testified under oath that as late as 2005, he still had not understood APB 25's fundamental terms or conditions. Keep this in mind when I discuss the destruction of Bill McGuire, who was not an accountant or a business lawyer, but a physician by training. As I said in my introduction, the downfall of executives engaged in backdating was not launched by a headline-seeking prosecutor like Rudy Giuliani, who targeted Mike Milken. It was launched by the intelligentsia. During the Reagan administration, the culturati became hysterical about a supposed age of greed. In 1993, the Budget Act for that year said that companies could not deduct amounts over $1 million paid to their top 5 executives unless that compensation were somehow related to performance goals. The obvious solution was to use stock options as compensation. And so stock options blossomed as a form of compensation in the 1990s, and not only for top executives, but also for brilliant young men who joined Silicon Valley startups in the hopes of gaining eventual riches. This phenomenon naturally attracted the attention of egalitarian academics who had little hope of gaining eventual riches. How do we know, they asked, that the income from these options is truly being earned according to a manner dictated by a purely Platonic theory of incentive? David Yermak, a professor of accounting at NYU, began the witch hunt in 1995 by arguing that executives might be engaged in spring-loading, that is, granting themselves options just before their company was going to issue some good news. That was not justifiable, according to the Platonic theory of incentive. In 2004, a professor of accounting at the University of Iowa, Eric Lee, put forward another idea, which violated the Platonic theory of incentive even more egregiously. He hypothesized that companies were looking back across the span of a month or so and setting the issuance date of options on a day that the stock had hit a relative low point. His argument for this was that executive options seemed to come just before stock rises, even when those rises were due to general market factors and not to company news. Two University of Michigan professors argued that Lee had not proven his case because he failed to recognize the extraordinary ability CEOs have to predict their company's stock movements, not only when they are based on internal news, but even when they are based on general market trends. Lee and his longtime friend Randall Herron answered this criticism by showing that after Sarbanes-Oxley's two-day reporting deadline had eliminated the possibility of backdating, executives' supposed ability to pick propitious dates faltered dramatically. At that point, the academic community granted that Lee had established the widespread existence of backdating in the awarding of option grants, as in fact he had. Such were the intellectual origins of the backdated options frenzy. But the specific instrument of Bill McGuire's destruction was a witch hunt conducted by a team of 4 reporters from the news department of the Wall Street Journal. The journal's witch hunt began after Eric Lee and Randall Herron tipped off the SEC about their discovery, but found that it created little stir. After all, Sarbanes-Oxley had eliminated backdating as of 2003. This was not the sort of scandal that was going to bring the SEC blaring headlines and bigger budgets. So a few companies targeted by the SEC announced that they were restating earnings, but they reassured investors that the restatements involved only non-cash expenses, and nobody blinked an eye. In early November 2005, the Journal ran yet another story about a company that the SEC had targeted because its options had been misstated, and typically the article was buried on page 7. But this time, Randall Herron decided to take action. 3 reporters were listed as having contributed to the article, and the email address of each was given at the end of the story. Herron sent each of the reporters information about what he and Eric Lee had found, namely that many executives had likely backdated their option grants prior to Sarbanes-Oxley. One of the reporters, Mark Marmont, had devoted much of his career to denouncing executive compensation, and so he seized on Herron's email. A few days later, he produced an article that served as a trial balloon. It laid out Lee's findings, listed a few cases the SEC had uncovered, and quoted the usual egalitarians as disapproving of the whole business. But a witch hunt Marmont knew must name names, and all Lee and Herron could cite were generalized statistics. The solution came from one of Marmont's colleagues at the Journal, Charles Farrell, who had recently graduated from Yale in applied math. Companies reported their financial filings the precise day on which their executive options were issued. Farrell suggested that they look at CEOs who had received large option awards and then ask how lucky were they to receive the grant on that day. What did that mean exactly? In the matter of option grants, Farrell argued, each day of the year could be ranked, from the most lucky to the least lucky, according to how much the stock underlying the option climbed or dropped in the 20 days following the option grant. By ranking the 220 business days of the year, you can thus say that the CEO received his award on the luckiest day of the year, or the second luckiest day of the year, or the third luckiest day, and so on through the year's 220 business days. Now suppose that year after year, an executive receives his option grants on exceptionally lucky days. then that is very suspicious. And you can express that degree of suspiciousness by saying how unlikely it would be for him to have received such lucky awards if they were handed out randomly. I hope that is clear, because that was the whole basis of the Wall Street Journal's backdated options frenzy. For the next 4 months, from November 2005 to March 2006, virtually nothing was seen in the journal about options and backdating. Behind the scenes, however, Mark Marmont was assembling his team, a group of 4 white, male, post-1960s Ivy League graduates. A journalism reporter dubbed the group Marmont's Wrecking Crew, and such is our journalistic culture that it was meant as praise. On March 18, 2006, the journal's Wrecking Crew launched their anti-capitalist witch hunt. The initial article named 6 executives, including Bill McGuire, and gave the odds of their having received their options by chance on the lucky days that they did. In the case of McGuire, the odds were about 1 in 200 million. If one took Farrell's assumption strictly, that was true. But the rhetoric of the article made a focus on the mathematics impossible. For example, the reporters gratuitously mentioned that the chances of winning the Powerball lottery with a $1 ticket was 1 in 146 million. That was an utterly misleading comparison. The Powerball lottery is supposed to operate by chance. Option awards are not. Farrell's calculations did not show that McGuire's so-called luck might have been achieved, not randomly, but by very conscious spring-loading, a practice that the SEC decided was perfectly legal. The Powerball comparison also insinuated that the result of backdating was a multi-million-dollar payoff, like the Powerball lottery. Not mentioned was the fact that years of backdating might produce $0 because of falling stock prices. The Wrecking Crew may not have been good reporters, but they were superb rhetoricians. One additional point is also very much worth noting. When the first article was published, neither the Wrecking Crew nor their editors had any idea whether backdating violated law or regulations. They too had not been able to figure it out. Their whole series was intended to rest exclusively on moral outrage derived from a Platonic theory of incentive, backed by egalitarian envy of wealth. From that first March article right through December 31st, 2006, what am I doing? The Wall Street Journal published more than 70 stories related to options and backdating, most of them as distorted as the first. In the end, approximately 200 companies were swept up in the backdated options frenzy to one degree or another. At least 100 executives, many of them chief executives, were ousted from the positions they had earned. Scores of businessmen were subjected to SEC investigations, and their fines ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Clawbacks, money taken away from the executives who had earned it, ran to many billions of dollars. Dozens of individuals were subjected to investigations by U.S. attorneys and threatened for months or even years with the prospect of prison. A handful of people, no different from the rest, actually went to prison. Greg Reyes for 18 months, Jim Tracy for 2 years. In 2007, the Wall Street Journal pulled together 17 of its major stories about backdated options as a submission to the Pulitzer Prize Committee. And the Wrecking Crew did indeed win the most prestigious award in journalism, the gold medal offered by the Pulitzer Prize Committee for the very best in public service journalism. Yet when it was all over, no one could quite say why the witch hunt had once seemed so important. Backdating scandal ends with a whimper. That was how the New York Times headlined on a story about one of the last prosecutions of backdating. Lee and Herron published a paper arguing that approximately 30% of all American firms had engaged in backdating. That is to say, about 2,000 companies. If they were right, and they had been right in the past, then fewer than 10% of all backdating companies had even been mentioned as possible backdaters, much less investigated and punished. And since backdating necessarily required at least several people at each firm, the number of individuals involved should have run to more than 10,000. So if the matter were truly as serious as the wrecking crew and the Pulitzer committee had made it out to be, hundreds or even thousands of businessmen should have gone to prison, not 5. The explanation for this anomaly is that the journal's backdated options theory was not a pursuit of justice. It was merely a frenzy, an egalitarian witch hunt targeting businessmen who had made lots of money from stock options. After a year or so, that excitement wore off, and the social justice warriors moved on to other causes, leaving the backdated options witch hunt to expire with a whimper. Nevertheless, the backdated options frenzy left more than a few victims in its wake, and I turn now to the greatest of them, Bill McGuire. I said earlier that my thesis concerns Ayn Rand's use of the term atlas as a symbol of great achievement and great victimization. Bill McGuire, I submit, was just such an atlas. And so it is apt, though entirely coincidental, that he is also a titan of a man, 6'6" and 260 pounds. Born in Troy, New York in 1948, his family was moved by his oil engineer father to a town near Galveston, Texas. Given McGuire's size, you will not be surprised to hear that he led his high school basketball team to a 25-3 season. You may be surprised to hear that he married his high school sweetheart and that they are still married. He received his medical degree in 1974 from the University of Texas with highest honors, even though he spent considerable time working on a sideline business, catching speckled trout and selling them to local restaurants. Following his graduate training, McGuire conducted basic research into the immunopathology of the lung. But he missed the hands-on aspect of patient care, and so in 1980 he moved to Colorado Springs, where he was board certified in pulmonary and internal medicine. Yet McGuire was not a Platonist when it came to medicine. As much as he enjoyed both scientific research and the art of healing, he knew that providing health care was a business, and his capacious mind was intrigued by the challenges of the healthcare business. In 1985, therefore, he took a 30% pay cut to become president and chief operating officer of Peak Health Plan of Colorado, which was working with the Colorado Springs Medical Center. If McGuire's interest in medical research, healing, and healthcare economics make him a Renaissance man, in his professional life, his non-professional pursuits extend the metaphor. Apart from fishing and basketball, the young Bill McGuire loved butterfly collecting. And in his adulthood, he wrote articles on Lepidoptera for scientific journals. He's even had several species named after him. And when he gave his collection to the University of Florida, it was valued at $40 million. Other hobbies include the collection of art, antiques, and fine wine. But I must confront, at least briefly, the difficult topic of McGuire's professional field, the healthcare business post-LBJ. In the late 1960s, top Republican congressmen were telling physician organizations that they had 3 years at most to create a nationwide system that would curb medical costs. If they did not, Teddy Kennedy and the overwhelmingly Democratic Congress created by LBJ's landslide of 1964 would impose a national health care system on America. Many physicians, Bill McGuire among them, thought that the Health Maintenance Organization was an institutional solution that could preserve some measure of non-governmental medicine. In my book, I will consider the highly contentious question of the HMO, but today I'm going to have to set it aside. In 1986, UnitedHealthcare Corporation of Minnesota absorbed Bill McGuire's Peak Health Plan, and McGuire joined the parent company as an executive vice president. At the time, UnitedHealthcare was a regional HMO with about $400 million in revenues, but losses of $16 million. In 1989, McGuire became chief operating officer. In 1991, he took charge as CEO and chairman. By the time that the wrecking crew brought him down, 15 years later, McGuire had generated an average annual return to investors of 30%, better than Jack Welch in his prime. And that includes not just the bubble economy of the 90s, but the years following the recession of 2001 and the terror attacks of 9/11. How did he do it? First, Bill McGuire believed that his company was in the business of providing effective and efficient medical care to people. His dictum was, when we improve health, we make money. When we improve health more, we make more money. Then, too, he was simply a brilliant executive. Cerebral, one journalist called him. And he devoted his astute mind to keeping close tabs on his company and on his industry. A colleague said he saw around the corner before you got to the corner. And there were the personal elements. He worked 6 days a week, minimum, and slept just a few hours a night. He had a stock analyst who followed the company closely. He ate, slept, and dreamed United. Nor was there such a thing as a vacation for Bill McGuire. When he was planning a family holiday in Scotland, he asked analysts to set up meetings for him with potential investors. Last and not least, McGuire did not fear other men's ability. He hired the successful CEO of Northwest Airlines to be his executive vice president. Such was the man who became the principal target of the Wall Street Journal's backdated options, Rich Hunt. On the Forbes 400 list of 2006, McGuire's wealth was estimated at $1.2 billion. Most of it was in the form of still unexercised options. When would he have had time to spend the money? $1.2 billion put McGuire at 322 out of the whole Forbes 400. Personally, I do not think that $1 billion+ is excessive wealth for a lifetime's work by a man of McGuire's talents. But by way of comparison, and without at all questioning the rights of inheritance, the same Forbes 400 list ranked the various heirs of Sam Walton 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. But the egalitarians went after Bill McGuire. Now, the takedown of Bill McGuire was accomplished by just two statistics, and the fact that he had made more than $1 billion from options was the first. This was wholly irrelevant by the wrecking crew's own terms. The only statistic in question should have been only the additional amount that McGuire may have made by his alleged backdating. But of course, that element of fairness was not observed. The other statistic came from Charles Farrell's algorithm. If one ranked the luckiness of all McGuire's option dates from 1966 to 2002, after which Sarbanes-Oxley made backdating impossible, what were the odds against McGuire's having experienced that degree of luckiness by sheer random chance? The answer was about 1 in 200 million. Conclusion, he must have backdated his options. Personally, I do not think that Bill McGuire or any other executive should have been fired, much less fined, much less imprisoned for backdating, given how little it was understood before the journal's Rich Hunt. But McGuire maintained that he had not consciously engaged in backdating as he understood it, and so that is the basis on which I am going to defend him here. What was the hard evidence behind Farrell's statistics that was adduced to prove McGuire's backdating? In this talk, I can look only at two examples of it, but they are typical. The first type, you know. McGuire's options fell on particularly lucky dates. The odds of those dates having been chosen at random were high. True enough. But whoever imagined that executives chose option dates at random? For 10 years, since 1995, academics had been debating which methods executives used to show that their options rewards were valuable. Some suggested it was timing options relative to good or bad corporate news. Others pointed out executives' ability to predict their stock's future, even when it was based on general market movement. These hypotheses were known to the wrecking crew. They should have used them to ask whether Farrell's long odds could be explained by means other than chance or backdating. But of course, they did no such thing. I shall. Take Bill McGuire's option grant of October 27, 1997. That was the stock's low point for the entire year. And so this option grant was featured in the very first story that the wrecking crew wrote on backdating. And a graph accompanying that story illustrated the matter. A chart of UnitedHealth's 1997 stock price showed that the date of October 27th was marked with a circle. If we look more closely into the matter, we see that UnitedHealth's stock lost 15% on that day. And yet within 7 trading days, it had fully regained that amount. The wrecking group pointed to the fact that Bill McGuire had chosen to take his options on the propitious October 27th low point as prima facie evidence of backdating. And the reader may well ask, how could McGuire have chosen the stock's yearly low in 1997, and a low that occurred just before such a sharp rise? Very simply, October 27, 1997 was the Asian stock market crash. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost more than 500 points that day, its third largest point loss ever. UnitedHealth Group stock fell 16% that day. But UnitedHealthcare had no significant Asian exposure. Its stock was merely being dragged down by the market. Within seven trading days, as noted, it had recovered. So there is no mystery at all about Bill McGuire's ability to pick that day as a propitious day to issue executive stock options. The same thing happened following 9/11 with other companies. And yet not once, so far as I have found, not once throughout an entire year of reporting on Bill McGuire and his stock option picks did the Wrecking Crew inform its readers that the Asian stock market crash took place on the day of Bill McGuire's supposedly implausible pick. They persisted in taking for their baseline assumption that the alternative was sheer chance, which they put at 1 in 220. And of course, their calculation that 220 to 1 were the odds against McGuire's picking October 27th, 1997, then went on to infect their further calculations of the odds against his whole series of option grants. Admittedly, we cannot know that McGuire chose his options on October 27, 1997 because of the Asian market crash. But according to the journal, Dr. McGuire stated that as a man of high ethical standards, he wouldn't have fabricated anything. And I believe him. Possibly he violated the requirements of APB 25 because he did not know them. Few people did know them, even a few accounting experts. But I feel certain that McGuire did not know those requirements and then consciously violate them. That would not be like him. Yet his accusers do make one more argument that is intended to prove McGuire did not choose the dates of his option grants based on his understanding of his company and its market. They make one more argument intended to show that he did use backdating, and this argument supposedly was a decisive argument during the board meeting that voted to oust McGuire. The argument begins with the fact that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act made backdating impossible by requiring that grants of options to executives be registered with the SEC within 2 days. Here is how the journal's article on the meeting that ousted McGuire made the case. Directors learned that after the mid-2002 passage of new federal rules requiring almost immediate disclosure of option grants, there wasn't a single quarter in which the large grants customarily given to top executives were dated at a quarterly low. The point, after rules had made backdating impossible, McGuire's purported ability to pick propitious grant dates vanished. That juxtaposition wounded a key line of defense and, quote, made everyone in the room sit up and focus, says one person close to the situation. Okay, let us again examine the evidence. I have time today to take only one example, but let us take 2003. Backdating is now impossible. And so we are told Bill McGuire's choice for the date of his options in 2003 was not the low for the year, nor even the low for the quarter. Looks bad, right? Proves that he had previously been backdating, right? Well, not really. Consider his choice of an option date in more detail. At the beginning of 2003, McGuire naturally expected to be pushing his stock higher and higher throughout the year. And so he naturally wanted to take his options early in the year. From January 1st onward, therefore, he was presumably looking for a dip in the stock price. The end-of-year stock price in 2002 was between 83 and 85, which was down 16% from the previous October's highs. So the price probably would not get much lower. But on February 12th, the stock dropped to 80 and a quarter, a level 4 points below its January 1st price, and on high volume. McGuire probably assumed that the doubters and skeptics had now been shaken out, and so he grabbed that day's price, 80 and a quarter, for his options. Over the next 2 days, however, the stock price fluctuated as much as half a point lower, down to 79 and 3/4, but then it took off. By mid-June, it was over 100 and split 2-for-1. So it's true, McGuire had not chosen the low for the year or even the low for the quarter. He chose a day when the stock price closed at 80 and a quarter. The next day it closed at 79 3/4. The day after that it closed at 80 even. That's 3 days in a row, all within half a point, and those 3 days together constituted the low for the year. McGuire chose the first rather than the second of those 3 days. And on the basis of that, we are told, Dr. McGuire's purported ability to pick propitious grant dates vanished. That is how you construct a lie out of the truth. Yet such was the evidence on which Bill McGuire's terrified board ousted him. When it became obvious that the members of UnitedHealth's board were caving into their fears, McGuire's old patron, Richard Burke, the man who had created UnitedHealth in 1973, proposed that McGuire merely step aside until the witch hunt had burned itself out. But McGuire said no. If the board would not back him, he wanted to leave. His resignation as chief executive was set for Friday, December 1st, 2006, less than 9 months since the Journal's witch hunt had begun. His last day at the office was Thursday, November 30th. And according to the Journal, a private man, McGuire left that day without emotional goodbyes. Said one person close to the matter, he slipped out without anyone noticing. Oddly enough, a novel has been written about Bill McGuire, or rather about men like him. Productive geniuses who know they have done nothing wrong and yet find themselves driven out from the successful businesses they have created by anti-capitalist intellectuals and government regulators and corporate cowards. They too slip out without anyone noticing. But in that novel, people do eventually notice. They notice that the productive creators are no longer around, and that the country seems to be stuck in a permanent malaise. The novel is called Atlas Shrugged. Thank you.
Roger, how has UnitedHealth Group done since they fired McGuire?
It's been done very well. As I said, McGuire was a man who was not afraid of talent. His president and COO, Stephen Hemsley, was chosen to succeed him. He was such a brilliant pick as president and CEO that when it was first announced, McGuire had to say, no, I'm staying. But he took over. He's done great. UnitedHealth has done great. So as far as that goes, the company itself has not suffered.
I have two questions, one practical, one philosophical, and I'd like to ask them both, and I'll sit down. Is there any way, in theory at least, that Bill McGuire could have avoided prosecution by disclosing maybe more than what was required without, negating his position? Like, for example, like where he'd published something in the Wall Street Journal, trying to anticipate prosecution of something of this type. So is there any way he could have, by doing more than what was required? That's the practical question. The philosophical question is, what do you think it will mean for society when the people like the Bill McGuires, the Martha Stewarts, perhaps more recently even the Bernie Madoffs, start becoming, if you're not being prosecuted by the SEC, there's got to be something wrong with you, What's it mean philosophically in that regard? Thank you.
On the first one, McGuire did not know how to fight the cultural fight. He tried to do things, and it was just throwing red meat to the lions. Everything he tried to do just made it look like he felt guilty, and he was appeasing them. He said, okay, look, we won't do options. We won't do executive options anymore. I'll return options, and it just, obviously it just fed the frenzy. I'm not sure about your last question. You're saying?
So, for example, people like Bill McGuire, who when you get the whole story, as they say in court, the whole truth, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You know, when you know the whole story, it takes on a whole new meaning. And Martha Stewart was supposedly witch hunted as well, and kind of makes me look at, well, I haven't heard anything good about Bernie Madoff. I'm waiting for somebody to say, all right, he was witch hunted too. I don't know. So what's going to mean when every time you get the whole story, you say, wait a minute, I thought Bill McGuire was bad, I thought Martha Stewart was bad, and now I'm finding out that they were just witch hunted. Okay, well, maybe all these other people, and you start, for someone like myself, we start wondering, can we trust anything? Is there any really bad people out there? And how do we know?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's one of the great problems, of going after the cases like Frank Quattrone, Mike Milken, and Martha Stewart. You no longer feel certain when it comes to a Bernie Madoff, whether you're getting the real story there either.
How could a person like myself actually do the research?
Right, very true. I don't know if anybody's heard about Charles Murray's new book. It's called By the People. He's proposing a huge thing called the Madison Foundation, which would go to bat. It would Jonah Goldberg called it, it's not like Institute for Justice on steroids. It's like the Institute for Justice struck by gamma rays from out of space. It's the Godzilla of the Institute for Justice. It would go to bat. It would look into the cases and go to bat for the ones who were justifiable. And of course, that would help. But this is the sort of thing that prosecutors are supposed to do themselves. They have prosecutorial discretion. They can say, this is not a big case. But I don't know.
Okay, that's honest. Thank you.
Anyone else? Alexander, I look forward to this.
How much of that problem might be resolved if people simply devoted enough attention when they read some article attacking somebody to understand exactly what the writer was accusing the person of and evaluate whether that would really have been a bad thing?
Yeah. That's true. You would hope that readers would say, wait a minute. You keep saying, if they had been granted by chance, but why is that the relevant standard? Options on a Powerball lottery. And of course, people do write letters to the editor, and sometimes there are a few favorable pro-capitalist journalists who write. They're just within the cultural context, they're swimming against the tide. The columnist of the Wall Street Journal, Holman Jenkins Jr., would try every month or so. Of course, it's professional courtesy. He can't attack his own colleagues, but he would try to say, look, this is a big nothing burger. There's no reason to backdate options. You can achieve the same effect by granting more at the exercise price. But he was swimming against the tide. And I should think he should have won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism, but obviously he didn't. So that's that.
Thank you, Roger. This was terrific and heartbreaking. So just a couple of quick questions. Was it the editors of the Wall Street Journal? Were they also part of the frenzy?
No. And it's up until, until the Murdochs took over the journal, it was well known throughout the journalistic world that the Wall Street Journal was schizophrenic. news pages were, in all polls, ranked further left than the New York Times. Its editorial pages, were probably further right than any other newspaper in the country. And yet, because of professional courtesy, the editorial pages could not attack their own reporters. So what they would do is, get a story from the New York Times and say, these reporters in the New York Times are getting it all wrong, even though it was exactly the same point that their own reporters were making. But no, the top editors, no, the ones who write the editorial pages, they were great. They were great. And the top reporter, Mark Mamont, his wrecking crew it was, said in a later interview, when they began attacking me, I figured, now I'm really getting to the plutocracy. So that was, he thinks in those sort of Marxist terms, and he just thought the editors of the journal represented the plutocracy in America.
Okay, another, early in your talk you said we shouldn't ask whether a certain businessman is corrupt or not, whether he's a crony capitalist or not. We should ask if he's a producer. But if the cronyism is a necessary means to the production or to some of the production, then isn't that relevant? And in your defense of these...
I knew this was going to come up. In fact, I put it in there.
I mean, to be virtuous, your means have to be right as well as your ends.
It's a matter of, you have to be aware of context and magnitude. And I will tell this story. When I was editing Navigator, always looking for stories, I decided one day, I guess I had heard an objectivist from ARI debating Christopher Hitchens, and is capitalism or socialism the moral system? And Hitchens would say, look at this capitalist, and the objectivist would say, that's not real capitalism. J.J. Hill built a transcontinental railroad without. The other guy would say, look at this capitalist, and the objectivist would say, J.J. Hill built a, the only capitalist he could come up with in the history of the world was J.J. Hill and his transcontinental railroad. So I said, well, let's look at J.J. Hill. And it turns out, he built his transcontinental extensions without federal help, but his entire original empire was built on land grants. I mean, that was how railroads were built in those days. So, there's a big difference between operating honestly within the system and a cylindra or something that's, what would you say, a non-producer who's getting money to be a non-producer.
Yeah, okay.
Would this have happened if the company were not public?
Would it have happened if the company were not public? Well, certain things would and certain things wouldn't have. For example, the Justice Department could still charge the companies, I guess, with fraud. Although even that might be, well, I think they could still charge the companies with fraud. Obviously, no, the SEC, rules for exchanges and publicly traded companies would not have applied. So, one of the great defenders of Bill McGuire and the others, was predicting this is the sort of thing that's going to drive people out of being publicly traded. We're going to start having more and more so-called private companies. So I think some things could be done, and some things could have been done to them. But the Justice Department never did go after McGuire. He was never threatened with prison, like Reyes and the others. This was pure SEC, so I suppose he would have been free and clear. Okay?
That's. Oh, well, yeah. Go ahead.
It just
One more. Brief comment. Since you mentioned that this was part of going, potentially having companies go private. After Sarbanes-Oxley, and I don't remember the exact statistics, I used to have them, but I did know 10 years after Sarbanes-Oxley, we were the only major industrialized country in the world that actually had fewer public companies 10 years later than we did before. So it did do exactly that.
I'll bet. Okay.
Great, thank you, Roger.
Thank you.